everybody, it is the Lawn Gnome, and welcome to the 17th episode of my special segment on my channel for 2019, 007, A Bondiful Year. And I am really excited today because we are tackling a great series of James Bond films for me. Why do you ask? Well, in November of 1995, after a long hiatus, James Bond comes back to theaters with the film GoldenEye, and this was when I was a freshman in high school. I had just turned 14. I had never seen a James Bond film on the big screen, but I did know who James Bond was, and by that time, the only James Bond film that I had seen was the 1964 classic Goldfinger. So my father says to me one day, "Hey Steve, there's a James Bond movie coming out in theaters. How about we go see it?" And thus began a tradition that I have still held to this very day, where my father and I go to see James Bond movies. So of course, GoldenEye stars a brand new James Bond in Pierce Brosnan, and at the time, I knew Pierce Brosnan from a little movie back in 1993 called Mrs. Doubtfire, so to actually see him in an action role was definitely going to be something exciting for me. This movie also has a stellar cast, including Sean Bean as Alec Trevelyan, Famke Janssen as Xenia Onatopp, and of course Alan Cumming as Boris, amongst a few. So in this movie, we are taken 9 years into James Bond's past, where he and 006, who is played by Sean Bean, have to foil a Russian operation. And it turns out that something goes terribly wrong, and 006 is lost in the process. Fast forward 9 years later, the Cold War is over, Russia is now enjoying a time of capitalism, and James Bond is still working for MI6. And in this film, we also get some new faces, not just as James Bond, but the whole franchise is given a massive overhaul, including Samantha Bond. It's kind of funny that her name is actually Bond, who plays the new Miss Moneypenny, but probably the highlight of this film is the new incarnation of M, because it is the first female M, and it is played by the great Judi Dench. And my goodness, she just steals every single scene that she is in. It's also a new era for the time as well, because this is the first time where James Bond is actually called out for being a misogynist pig, which I thought was actually kind of funny, given everything that James Bond had done up until this point. But Pierce Brosnan, now when we take a look back at him as James Bond, he is very hit or miss. Some people just call him a flat-out pretty boy, but in this movie he definitely isn't. He has the Timothy Dalton drama and action persona, but he also has a beautiful hybrid of charisma, charm, and comedy that is a beautiful mix between Sean Connery and Roger Moore. We really get the perfect James Bond package in Pierce Brosnan's performance in GoldenEye. Not only that, but we also have an excellent song in the beginning of this movie that is sung by Tina Turner, and it's not just that. The music as a whole is just fantastic in this movie, because the song, while it was sung by Tina Turner, was actually written by U2's Bono and The Edge. I didn't even realize that, but that is just one of the coolest things ever, to know that U2 had a part in making a James Bond song, even though they weren't performing it. And the score, ever since the Billy Conti score in For Your Eyes Only in 1981, we never really got a strong score in the James Bond world. But thanks to Eric Serra, who 1 year later would go on to score one of the greatest science fiction cult classics of all time in The Fifth Element, what a great score. It is interesting, it's got some really great techno beats in it, definitely something that we never heard in a James Bond film, and it was just such a great score that drives the movie. But the story itself is great too, because in this film, it's all about a brand new high-tech satellite jamming system that Russia has been working on, and a couple of rogue Russian agents happen to steal it thanks to an inside job by a computer programmer named Boris, who is played by Alan Cumming. And Alan Cumming is not necessarily a henchman in this movie, he's just like a freelance villain, but he is without a doubt one of the best parts of this movie because he is funny. He's got some great lines in this movie. I mean, whenever someone who is a James Bond fan jumps up in a crowd and yells, "I am invincible," you know exactly what James Bond character you're talking about. But also the villain in this movie is fantastic. Sean Bean. I didn't even know who Sean Bean was in this movie when I saw it for the first time, but now, because of all the great movies that I have seen him in, as well as Game of Thrones, this was one of his greatest performances as Alec Trevelyan. He is such a deep character because there's so much more to him when we find out that he is not, in fact, dead after the events in the opening sequence, and he is now on for a personal vendetta against Britain because of his past, and he wants to use GoldenEye for the sake of jamming all of the technology satellites that are connected to Britain for the sake of basically plunging them and even the world into chaos. We also have his henchman, Famke Janssen's character Xenia Onatopp. This is one of the few times where we actually see a female as the main henchman, and she is such a character in this movie, even though I talked about earlier how James Bond is knocked for sexual harassment. The fact that she is probably one of the most inappropriate counterparts to that whole statement is quite funny, but Famke Janssen just lights up the screen when she's there, and she also has some of the funnier lines in this film. We also have Isabella Scorupco, who plays the leading lady, Natalia Simonova. She is definitely a great character as well. There's so much depth to her, even though we don't get too much, but she definitely gives us a great performance, and she does play very well off of James Bond. But GoldenEye, especially after not seeing James Bond on the big screen for so many years, we really get the perfect package in GoldenEye. Everything about this movie is wonderful. This is one of the few James Bond films that I feel has the most rewatchability. It really is a fantastic roller coaster ride, and after seeing that movie, my dad just was smiling, saying James Bond is back. This movie was such a staple in the world of James Bond that it actually became a video game. And he comes back in such a big way in this film. The best way to describe it: he drives a tank. I'm not gonna get into those details. You just gotta see this movie for yourself if you haven't yet, but if you are a James Bond fan, you are probably saying the exact same things that I am right now, and this one is probably in your top 5, if not definitely your top 10. So great to finally have seen James Bond on the big screen thanks to GoldenEye, and let me just say, it pretty much instilled my fandom as a James Bond fan for years to come. So I am going to be giving GoldenEye a very proud 4 stars out of 4. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. Please leave your comments in the box below, and let's discuss GoldenEye, and I will see you in the next episode. Hey, thank you so much for stopping by my channel today. If you're new here and want to see more of what my channel has to offer, please click on the link to my last video, or hit that subscribe button to be kept up to date with all of my uploads. Content of all sorts is posted here quite often, so trust me, you do not want to fall behind. I will see you in the comments, and actions speak louder than words.